My name is Estela Vazquez, and I have something to say. When I received the call from May to ask me if I would accept the award, I was a little bit concerned, intimidated. As to whether or not I was entitled to it. But then I thought that having something to say about struggle, resistance, participation, especially from a Latino perspective, for an immigrant perspective in New York, it was something that be worthwhile sharing for future generations. And for other people that 20, 30, 40, 50 years from now, just like in Clara's case, may not know there was a struggle in this time period where women, Latinos, and other people participated, where there was a worker's voice in the struggle. I was born in the Dominican Republic 76 years ago. At the time that I was born, there was a very brutal dictatorship that was the result, the product of the earlier 1916 invasion of the United States. The Marines invaded Dominican Republic and Haiti, 2015, 2016. So I grew up hearing about Papa Trujillo. You know, he was the supreme chief. As a matter of fact, I remember in every household in the Dominican Republic, when I was growing up, I had a picture of Trujillo displayed in the living room or whatever in the wall. And the inscription under the photo was, "En esta casa, Trujillo es el jefe." In this house, Trujillo is the chief. Growing up under a dictatorship, you never heard about opposition. He was the supreme chief, he was the supreme commander. And then in 1961, May 60 or 61, he was executed in an ambush by some of his former military officers and actual officers. And that opened the floodgates of information in the country. All those stories began to emerge after the execution of Trujillo. The example of what had happened in Cuba, the figures of Che Guevara, Fidel Castro, were no longer to scare us, but we began to understand what they meant. And it was, as I said before, it was like you have been with your eyes covered, and suddenly the veil is moved, and you begin to see the reality that you don't have running water, and you have to carry water to your house, not because you're bad, but because there are economic conditions that create that. I must have been 14, 15, I think 14, the first time I got arrested. And I was arrested with my friend. My friend, his name was Elias Santos Brito. We live in the same neighborhood. And I remember that we were taken to Fortaleza Osama. And his father, which we used to call Rompehueso, bomb breaker, went to the prison, to La Fortaleza, and told them to give us for lunch, for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, a beating. But we were released the same day, and when I got home, I got a good spanking. Some here, back here. I still have a mark somewhere in my head, because my father said, "Las niñas no hacen eso. Girls don't do that." And I said, and I guess it must have happened in other households for women and young men of my generation. I remember telling my dad, because your generation did not stand up. That's why we had Trujillo for all those years. April 24, 1965, the leader of the Dominican Revolutionary Party goes on the radio. At 12 noon, he had a radio program and makes a call for people to go to Puente Duarte, which is the bridge that connects the two sides of the Dominican city, which is bisected by El Rio Sama. And the military, the Dominican Air Force, bombed, strapped with machine gun, the crowd that day. So that was the event that generated an outpouring of resistance. And within the next days, there was a 24th, so 25th, 26th, 27th, soldiers that were supportive of the Constitution joined the officers, and people started taking over police stations, arming themselves. And on April 28th, President Lyndon B. Johnson announces that there are 55 communists controlling the uprising in the Dominican capital, and the Marines will land to protect Americans alive. And they did. And in the process, they created, after the 28th, what they call cordón de seguridad, a corridor. They practically divided the city in two. And to go from one side to the other, it's like you take Fifth Avenue and put soldiers on both sides of the street. To go across, you had to go through checkpoints manned by US Marines. And eventually, 42,000 Marines ended up occupying the Dominican Republic. The Dominican Army begins in the northern part of the city, an offensive against the Constitucionalistas. I have crossed the American lines to go and take a bath and get my clothes changed. And I'll get trapped in the offensive and I get arrested. One policeman recognized me and I get arrested. And then I went to La Victoria, which is an infamous Dominican jail. Any Dominican knows about La Victoria. And at that point, the airport was closed. There was fighting all over the city. There were some people that never got to La Victoria that were killed, arrested and killed on the way to La Victoria. My mother was already in New York. My mother came here in 1962. And her reaction was, reach out to the Organization of American States, figure out how to get into the country as soon as they resume flights. And that's what she did. She got there at the end, pretty close at the end of July. I don't know remember the exact date. And I was only 16, 17. They agreed to release me to her custody. And by the way, already she was making plans to bring us to New York. So we already had passports. So I ended up in New York. Okay. Not that I wanted to be here. This was a cultural shock for me. I mean, I come from a city that is still in a military conflict occupied by US Marines. So I get here in 1965. One of my cousins who worked as a dishwasher in a cafeteria named Cafeteria Dixon on 43rd Street and 8th Avenue, right? What then later became the headquarters of 1199. And one of his co-workers was fascinated by this cousin that had fought in a military uprising, a popular uprising in the Dominican Republic. We met, we fell in love. What I thought was the normal thing to do then. And we got married. And I had my first child, Evelyn. She's now 57 years old. Then later I got another child who is now 55. His name is Alejandro. And eventually, in the best tradition of Latino machos, he had an affair with another woman. I found out about it. I was a single mother, 2 kids, and I went on public assistance. And this period of the early 70s also coincided with the upheaval that was taking place in this country. The Young Lords had emerged in East Harlem. Black Panthers predate the Young Lords. There was El Comité, another group in the West Side. And I began to understand that here, in what Jose Marti called the belly of the beast, there was also struggle. That there had been Attica, the war in Vietnam, the Black Panthers, the Young Lords, I remember they took over 2nd Avenue to burn the garbage that was not being collected by New York sanitation from a poor and working class neighborhood. There was a lot of things going on. In the West Side, Amsterdam, Columbus, the El Comité began to organize tenants that were losing their apartments. In the Lower East Side, other activists were doing homesteading. And all of that combined. And I began to get engaged, to understand that there was also political struggle inside here in the country, that the government of the United States, the Yankee government, was one thing, but that working people, people of color, native people in this country were another. So there was a lot of struggles around especially with El Comité and the Young Lords, of bringing the issue of Puerto Rican independence. Because in 1976 was the bicentennial of the United States, and the Puerto Rican Socialist Party and other progressive forces organized this incredible march in Philadelphia called Bicentenario Sin Colonias. Bicentennials without a colony. And there was a big rally at Madison Square Garden where Russell Means spoke, because the takeover of Wounded Knee had already happened. So all those things. Then fast forward, 1984, hospital workers go on strike, a disastrous strike that lasted 47 days. And here in East Harlem, I was engaged in a housing struggle around the question of gentrification. And I used to go to the picket lines to support the striking healthcare workers. And that disastrous strike brought about a movement within the ranks of 1199 for democracy in the Union, and culminated in 1986 on an election that was supervised by the National Relations Board, and what I jokingly and affectionately refer as the insurgents. The insurgents won the election. After 86, I approached Dennis Rivera, and I was hired temporarily to work around the question of home care workers. There was a newly emerging industry in the city of New York in terms of the service industry. And I ended up being permanently hired in August as an organizer in the home care division. The biggest accomplishment in my life. Suddenly, I have been an activist all those years, but that was not all I did. I had to work and pay the rent and go to school and get graduated and so on, get separated, divorced from my first husband. And suddenly I found myself working for this incredible organization that believe in the same things that I believe. That workers are entitled to better working conditions, better salary, health benefits, that the community that has espoused the philosophy and the dreams of Dr. Martin Luther King. I was going to get paid for doing what I have done since the age of 15, because I believe in the idea of changing society to create a better world for working people. And suddenly I found myself in this extraordinary organization with a newly elected leadership that believe in union democracy, and these incredible workers that everything that they have gained over the years was one to a struggle. It's not that the bosses gave it to them. They took to the picket lines. They fought for what they have. And I felt privileged. I felt that this was the ideal job for me. And I stayed there for over 30 years. The next contract was a challenge, a real challenge for the leadership. And I was assigned to Mount Sinai Hospital. They still remember what happened in '84, that the promises that were made by the leadership about all these things that they were going to get did not materialize. So in '89, we had the challenge of how to give the workers the confidence that if we are in this fight, but we're going to be in this fight differently than what we did it in '84. Instead of going out for an unlimited strike, we're going to go gradually. So the first strike was a one-day strike. Total success. The second, we could do negotiations moving nowhere. Then there was a 3-day strike called, and it was incredible. We marched from St. Luke's Hospital in the West Side here down to Fifth Avenue. And Fifth Avenue was clogged with tens of thousands of healthcare workers from all over the city marching to Mount Sinai Hospital. We did a similar march in the Bronx. And I think the organizing effort that the union staff and leadership engaged in, of how we get this army of men and women, mostly women, because the majority of healthcare workers are women and men, to vote for a 1-day strike, a 3-day strike, and it's not until later in the negotiations that we took out the call for an all-out strike. And as a matter of fact, the strike was supposed to start 5 or 6 a.m. in the morning, and we got the word. Remember, there was no cell phones. You had to deal with telephones. And we got beepers at that time to be able to, you got beep, and then you had to have a quota and call back to the union headquarters that we had a contract. Before we got that contract with the League of Voluntary Hospitals, we had settled with the Catholic hospitals, that there were few, there's no more Catholic hospitals in New York. And I remember it was a big rally when we got that contract at Riverside Church, where Jesse Jackson spoke. And he said, if Cardinal O'Connor, who was the head of the Catholic Church, can do it, so can the League of Voluntary Hospital. We got 7.5% for that contract. And then we settled, the League settled with us. And I remember organizing a rally in the cafeteria at Mount Sinai, where Dennis came and spoke. And we had a button that said, the pride is back. It was like we lifted the spirit of combativeness, of resistance, of fight, and confidence in those workers, all collectively, by getting that contract. That struggle for that that contract of '89 after the election of Dennis Rivera, to me was the most exciting period. Well, they have had a whole bunch of exciting periods in 1199, but that was a lesson to the members. Who has the power? We got the power. What kind of power? Union power. Actively supporting the coalition, still supporting, and I have had for years now, the coalition to free Mumia Abu Jamal and Leonard Peltier. I was part of 33 Women for Oscar Lopez Rivera, and I also worked back in the 70s in the freedom of the excarceration of the 5 Puerto Rican nationalists, along with Frankie Vergara, Lulu, Espy, and many other friends and comrades that I made through the 70s and the struggle for Puerto Rico's independence. So that issue of political prisoners, it is still very important to me. I still think that in the midst of all the other challenges in this country and struggles, that issue of political prisoners, there be former members of the American Indian Movement or the Black Panther Party, it is still a significant struggle to wage. It is a sad note in a country where 70-year-old men, and I forgot the exact age of Leonard, but I think he's around my age, and I'm 76, that these two freedom fighters, these two symbols of African American struggle and the native people whose hand was stolen over 500 years ago when Columbus got lost, that Leonard is still in jail. And I'm still deeply committed to that struggle. And I was in awe, and I'm still am, of the Black Lives Matter movement. Because I don't know how many people realize in this country the impact that the Black Lives Matter movement had around the world. There were demonstrations in Australia where the Aboriginal people and others demonstrated in Latin America, Brazil. So the Black Lives Matter movement was an incredible, it mobilized millions of people in this country and around the world. I remember we did a march organized by Latinos for Black Lives Matter. We marched, well, we were still in the tail end of the pandemic, so my grandson will not let me march. And so I had to ride in a car with him from Washington Heights to the People's Church in East Harlem, which is where the Young Lords occupied and created that movement. And now what is going on around the universities? Colombia just recently removed the protesters, and I don't believe, and some philosophers said that history does not repeat itself, and when it does, it's a farce. But I cannot help thinking about the occupation of '68. I was actively supporting the students in 1985 when there was the divestment movement, and they also occupied Hamilton Hall. But the struggle now for a ceasefire in Palestine, it is something to admire. I am part of something that it is called Radical Elders. So we had a press conference in front of Columbia University. Actually, that same night is when the Columbia was removed, calling in YPD. The question for a struggle and peace in the Middle East, for a ceasefire, is something that I think is important. I have gone to a number of the demonstrations. The only problem, they have long marches, and I can no longer do a long march. I will go, stand at the rally, walk for a few blocks, but I have a bad hip, so I cannot. I was yesterday at the May Day demonstration in Foley Square, and what was rewarding to me, and I was with comrades from the radical elders, is that when I was sitting, waiting for radical elders to arrive with the banner, how many young people, and God, they all look younger than my grandchildren. So I now in my old age, my 76 year, when I go to a demonstration, a protest, an event to hear somebody speak, I feel so glad when I see so many young people that are the ages of my grandchildren and even younger than them, taking out the baton for struggle. And I think of what it was like when I was 14, 15, 16, when I came to this country and learned from the examples of others in the struggle. I must also say that in my second marriage, I married to an activist, an former anti-war, well, we met in the 70s, anti-war activist. His name was Kim Martin, and he was a member of the Workers' World Party. And he was also a labor activist. He was a member of the Newspaper Guild. And he was very supportive, so, which my first husband wasn't. But he was, because he was also a fighter, he was also somebody who served as an example, was supportive, and who had no issue with had late night meetings with the 1199, because if you're a hospital worker organizer, hospitals don't close. They're 24/7, 365 days a year. Patients don't go home for the holidays, and neither do the hospital workers. I just want to share my experience in, I attended the conference of Latin American feminists in Uruguay. And because the conference was in South America, of course, it had a large presence for all the women from Brazil. And I remember we had a whole conversation within the conference, and the issue was the presence of women of African descent. And we ended up being that the black women in the conference ended up leading the march, and they had a wonderful chant. They said, "Somos las hijas y las nietas de las negras que no pudieron matar." And said, "We are the daughters, the granddaughters, the great-granddaughters of the African women that you did not kill." And it was like having that continuity in the, that we are the descendants of all those women, whether it was the immigrants that came to this country from Ireland, potato famine, the pogroms from Russia, the peasants from Italy, England, Germany, that came here and had to fight for, those early immigrants had to fight and confront racism, discrimination, the Native Americans who saw themselves better than the Italians or the Irish or the Russian Jews. And we're still having those fights, because now it's the immigrants from Latin America, from Africa, from Asia, that are now confronting the things that earlier waves of immigrants confronted. But now their children, some of them have forgotten that in this country, the only non-immigrants, I mean in the United States, are the indigenous people and the African people that were brought here in chains, enslaved. And that is a lesson that we need to remind everybody.